Kweku never imagined his life would turn out this way. Only a year ago he was helping his mother sell vegetables in the open market, laughing with neighbors and working hard to make ends meet. He had grown up in a world where money was scarce but love and community were plenty. Now, as he walked through the endless halls of Abina's father's mansion, everything felt too grand, too polished, too heavy with silence. The chandeliers sparkled with blinding beauty, the marble floors reflected his every step, but none of it warmed his heart. The wedding had been a spectacle. The newspapers called it the union of the century. Guests had traveled in luxury cars, dressed in suits that cost more than Kweku had ever earned in his entire life. Cameras flashed as Abina walked down the aisle in a gown that shimmered like morning light on water. Everyone whispered about the groom, this unknown young man from nowhere, standing proudly beside the billionaire's daughter. Some said he was lucky, others said he was clever, but only a few could see the truth. Kweku loved her and she loved him. Abina had always been different from the people in her world. She was gentle, quick to smile, and never spoke with pride or arrogance. Kweku met her long before he knew she was the daughter of Nana Owusu, the most powerful businessman in the city. At first, she came to the market quietly, buying vegetables from his mother's stall. Their conversations began small, simple words about food and prices, but slowly grew into stories, laughter, and companionship. Love found them in the most ordinary of moments, not in the sparkle of riches but in the warmth of sincerity. Still, marriage had changed things. Kweku was no longer standing in the dusty streets of the market. He was now inside a mansion guarded by gates taller than the tallest palm tree. The servants bowed when he walked by, but their eyes never hid the questions they carried. Was he truly worthy of their madam? Did he deserve to sit at the same table as Nana Owusu's family? Kweku told himself he did not care, but sometimes the weight of it pressed on him. Abina noticed. She always did. "Don't listen to them," she would whisper, her hand resting on his. "You are my choice. That is all that matters." But there was one thing Kweku could not ignore: the basement. It was a large steel door at the far end of the mansion's east wing, hidden behind velvet curtains and guarded by a heavy lock. Unlike the other rooms, which were filled with art, flowers, and life, this door carried an air of mystery. It was cold and unwelcoming, and Kweku noticed how the servants avoided walking near it. The first time he asked Abina about it, she hesitated. Her smile faltered and her voice softened. "It's nothing important. Just old things my father keeps stored." But Kweku was not satisfied. Something about the door pulled at him, like an invisible thread tying him to a truth he did not yet understand. Whenever he walked past it, his heart would race, his palms would grow damp, and memories from his childhood, memories he could not place, would flash across his mind. He would see shadows, hear whispers, and feel the presence of something long hidden. One evening, after a family dinner filled with laughter and chatter, Kweku found himself wandering alone. The house was quiet now, the servants asleep, Abina resting peacefully in their room. He walked aimlessly through the halls until his steps brought him again to the east wing. There it was, the locked basement door shining faintly under the dim light of the corridor. He stopped. The silence of the mansion pressed on his ears. The smell of polished wood and perfume lingered in the air. And yet, beneath it all, he thought he caught another scent, faint but real. It smelled of earth, of dust, and of something older, something hidden. Kweku leaned closer. He placed his hand on the cold steel of the door, and for a moment, he swore he felt it, like a heartbeat pulsing faintly beneath his palm. His chest tightened, his breath caught, and his mind swirled with confusion. Why did this door feel alive? Why did it feel familiar? He pulled back, shaken, and returned to his room. Abina stirred in her sleep and turned to face him, her eyes half closed. "Are you all right?" she whispered. "Yes," Kweku replied quickly, though his heart was still racing. "Just couldn't sleep." But he knew it was not the truth. Something inside that basement was calling him. Something tied to his past, though he could not yet explain how. Days turned into weeks, but the feeling never left. Every time Kweku walked through the mansion, he found his eyes drifting toward the east wing. The servants continued to avoid it, and Abina never spoke of it again. Yet the more he tried to ignore it, the stronger the pull became. Sometimes at night he would dream. In those dreams he was a child again, running barefoot through the narrow streets of his old neighborhood. His father's voice echoed in the distance, calling his name. But each time Kweku turned, he could not see his father's face. Instead, the dream always ended with the image of a locked door. The same steel door from the mansion. Kweku would wake with sweat on his forehead and an ache in his chest. His father had passed away when he was very young, leaving behind only fragments of memories and his mother's stories. But now, as the dreams grew stronger, Kweku began to wonder if there was something about his father he had never been told. And that basement, silent, cold and locked away, seemed to hold the answer. As he stood one morning on the balcony with Abina, watching the city below, Kweku tried to push the thoughts aside. She leaned into him, smiling, her eyes filled with love. For her, he would give the world. But deep in his heart, he knew he could not keep ignoring the basement. It was no longer just a door in a mansion. It was a door into his past. And soon he would have to open it. The mansion stood tall and silent against the night sky, its walls glowing faintly in the pale light of the moon. To most people it was a symbol of power and wealth, a place where luxury lived in every corner. But to Kweku the grand house often felt like a prison, one filled with questions no one seemed willing to answer. Every hallway whispered secrets, every locked door carried a story. And none haunted him more than the basement door. By day, life in the mansion flowed as usual. Servants moved quietly from room to room, polishing the marble floors and arranging flowers in golden vases. Abina went about her days with her usual grace, smiling warmly whenever she saw her husband. She tried to make the vast house feel less empty by sharing laughter, little walks in the garden, and long talks over dinner. But even then, Kweku's eyes often drifted toward the east wing. Even when he wasn't near it, the door lived in his mind like a shadow he could not escape. At night, when silence fell and the house seemed to hold its breath, the unease grew worse. Lying beside Abina, Kweku would hear it, soft sounds, faint and unclear. At first, he told himself it was the wind moving through the old pipes or perhaps rats in the walls. But as the days passed, he began to notice a pattern. The noises were never random. Sometimes it was a low shuffle like feet dragging across the floor. Other times it was an echo, a faint knock, or the distant sound of something being moved. He tried to ask Abina again. "That basement," he said one morning, trying to sound casual, "what exactly is stored down there?" Abina's face softened into a smile, but there was something forced in her eyes. "It's just storage, Kweku. Old furniture, broken machines, things no one needs anymore." She reached out and placed her hand over his. "Don't let your mind trouble you with small matters." Her words were kind, but they did nothing to calm him. If anything, they made him more certain that something was being hidden. Abina had never lied to him before, yet her voice wavered slightly whenever the basement came up. One evening, the rain fell hard against the windows, drumming on the glass like restless fingers. The corridors glistened in the dim light, their marble floors reflecting faint streaks of gold from the chandeliers. Kweku couldn't sleep, so he wandered the halls. The house was quieter than usual, as though even the storm outside could not break the stillness. As he turned into the east wing, his steps slowed. There, at the far end near the heavy basement door, stood the old caretaker. The man was tall and thin, his back bent from years of work, his face worn like cracked leather. Kweku had seen him many times, always quiet, always working in the shadows. But tonight he seemed different. The caretaker held a large ring of keys in his hands. His eyes darted left and right, scanning the corridor nervously. For a moment, he reached toward the lock, his fingers brushing against the steel, then quickly pulled back as though the door burned him. Kweku's breath caught in his throat. He pressed himself against the wall, watching silently. The caretaker lingered, clutching the keys, his lips moving in what looked like a whisper or a prayer. Then, with a sudden glance over his shoulder, he turned and hurried away down the corridor. Kweku remained frozen, his heart pounding. His mind raced with questions. Why was the caretaker at the basement so late at night? Why had he looked so afraid? And why did he have the keys? The echoes of the man's footsteps faded, leaving Kweku alone with the sound of the storm outside. The steel door loomed at the end of the hall, still locked, still silent. But in Kweku's eyes, it was no longer just a door. It was a wall between him and the truth. He walked back to his room, his thoughts heavy. Abina was asleep, her breathing soft and steady. He lay down beside her but could not close his eyes. The image of the caretaker, trembling with the keys in his hands, refused to leave his mind. The following days brought no peace. Kweku tried to live as though nothing had changed, but every time he passed the east wing, his heart beat faster. He began to notice other things too. The servants never mentioned the basement, and if their eyes happened to glance toward it, they looked away quickly. Once, as he approached the corridor, two maids suddenly stopped their whispering and hurried off, leaving him with silence and suspicion. Kweku's dreams grew stronger as well. Again he saw the same door. Again he heard his father's voice calling just out of reach. Each time he woke, sweat soaked his body, and his chest ached with a longing he could not name. One afternoon, while Abina was away visiting her cousin, Kweku found himself standing once again before the steel door. He could not help it. His feet had carried him there without thought. The curtains hung heavy, the lock gleamed faintly, and the air felt colder here than in the rest of the house. He placed his hand on the door. The steel was cold, but this time the faint pulsing he had felt before returned. A steady thrum like a heartbeat vibrated beneath his palm. His breath quickened and a shiver ran down his spine. "What are you hiding?" he whispered, his voice trembling. He pulled back quickly when he heard footsteps echoing behind him. It was the caretaker again, his eyes widening when he saw Kweku so close to the door. For a brief moment, fear flashed across the old man's face. Then he bowed stiffly and hurried past, pretending not to notice. But Kweku noticed. The truth was there, written in the man's eyes. Something dangerous, something powerful was locked in that basement. That night as he lay awake, Kweku made up his mind. If the caretaker had the keys, then so could he. And once he had them, he would go down into the basement himself. He did not know what he would find, but he knew one thing. It was tied to his past, to his father, and to the restless voice that would not leave him. The mansion could keep its secrets only for so long. The storm that had shaken the city all evening still rumbled faintly in the distance. The mansion stood still, its wide halls cloaked in silence. Rainwater slid down the tall windows, tapping like fingers against the glass. Most of the house slept, unaware of the restless thoughts that kept Kweku awake. All night, he had turned in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady beat of the storm. His heart was louder than the thunder, urging him, pushing him toward the basement door. The caretaker's fearful eyes, the strange pulsing behind the steel, and his own unanswered questions. Everything came together in that moment. He could not wait anymore. Tonight he would face the secret. Carefully Kweku rose from bed. He looked at Abina sleeping peacefully beside him. Her face was calm, untouched by the worries that haunted him. For a moment guilt tugged at him. He didn't want to break her trust, but he couldn't carry the weight of his questions any longer. Quietly he slipped on his slippers, took a candle and left the room. The hall stretched before him, dim and quiet. The storm had taken away the electricity, leaving the house in near darkness. Only the faint glow of his candle lit the way. The flame flickered with every draft of air as he walked carefully, his footsteps echoing faintly on the polished floors. Each step toward the basement felt heavy, as though the house itself wanted to hold him back. When he reached the east wing, the air grew colder. The great steel door loomed at the end of the corridor, just as it had in his dreams. For a moment he almost turned back. But the thought of his father's voice, soft, calling, waiting, gave him the strength to move forward. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key. Earlier that evening, when the caretaker had left his keys on a table in the kitchen, Kweku had carefully taken one. He prayed it was the right one. His hands shook as he pushed the key into the lock. For a long moment nothing happened. Then came a soft click. The sound echoed like thunder in his chest. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a stairway that sank deep into the earth. Cold air rushed out, smelling of dust and forgotten years. His candlelight stretched down the steps, brushing against old stone walls. Taking a deep breath, Kweku stepped inside and closed the door gently behind him. The stairs groaned under his weight, each step sending a shiver through his body. Shadows twisted along the walls as the flame wavered. At the bottom, he entered a wide room filled with old furniture covered in white sheets, broken machines and piles of boxes. Dust clung to everything, rising in small clouds with every movement. The silence was deep, broken only by the sound of dripping water from somewhere in the corner. Kweku walked slowly, his eyes scanning the room. He felt watched, though no one was there. He moved past the boxes, brushing his fingers across the faded wood, until something caught his eye. In the far corner, half hidden under a sheet, stood a wooden trunk. It was larger than the others, its surface worn and dark with age. His chest tightened as he moved closer, lifting the sheet away. The sight froze him. Carved into the wood, clear even in the dim candlelight, was a name. His father's name. Kweku's breath stopped. His knees weakened, and for a moment he thought the ground would give way beneath him. He reached out with trembling fingers, tracing the letters as though touching his father himself. The air grew heavy around him, thick with memories of the man he had lost. With shaking hands he opened the trunk. The hinges groaned, dust rising like a sigh from the past. Inside were neatly arranged bundles of letters, faded photographs, and stacks of documents tied with string. Kweku's eyes widened as he lifted one paper after another. His father's handwriting covered them, strong and familiar, pulling him back to childhood. The letters spoke of dreams, plans for businesses, ideas to build a future, words filled with hope and determination. The photographs showed his father as a younger man, standing proudly with workers, smiling in front of buildings, shaking hands with people Kweku did not know. And then came the documents, contracts, agreements, records of money, investments, and land. Confusion rushed through him, followed quickly by anger. Why were these things here? Why, of all places, had his father's belongings been locked away in this mansion, hidden in his wife's family basement? Kweku's candlelight flickered across the papers, revealing more details. Some of the documents carried the signature of Abina's father. His heart pounded as realization began to form in his mind. The two men had been connected somehow. But why had no one told him? He sank to his knees, holding one of the photographs close. His father's eyes looked back at him, full of life and ambition. Memories flooded his mind, the warmth of his father's hand, the sound of his laughter, the lessons he used to share. The pain of losing him so suddenly had never left, but now it was mixed with betrayal. Had Abina known? Did her family know that his father's belongings were hidden beneath their home? The thought burned in his chest. He loved his wife deeply, but the silence around this secret cut into his heart. The storm outside thundered, shaking the walls slightly. Kweku sat there, surrounded by dust and shadows, his candle flame trembling as if it too felt his confusion. He wanted answers, but all he had were questions written in faded ink. Clutching one of the letters tightly, he whispered into the cold air, "Father, why are you here? What happened to you?" But only the sound of dripping water replied. As the candle burned lower, he gathered the letters and a few documents, tucking them under his arm. He closed the trunk carefully, though his hands shook. The weight of the truth pressed down on him, heavy as the storm above. Kweku climbed the stairs slowly, each step echoing louder than the last. When he reached the top and closed the basement door, the silence of the mansion returned, but it felt different now. The house no longer seemed like a stranger's home, it was a keeper of his father's hidden story. He walked back to his room, his mind racing. Abina still slept peacefully, unaware of what he had discovered. He stood by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, holding the letter tightly in his hand. The basement had answered one question but opened 100 more. And deep inside, Kweku knew this was only the beginning. The truth of his father's past was tied to Abina's family, and the secret, once uncovered, would change everything. The sun rose slowly over the city, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and gold. In the mansion, silence lingered, broken only by the clinking of dishes in the kitchen as servants began their morning routines. But Kweku was awake long before dawn. Sleep had not touched him. His mind was a restless storm, circling around the trunk he had discovered the night before. The letters, the photographs, the documents, all of it swirled inside him like fire. His heart ached with the weight of the discovery, but his anger and confusion gave him no peace. He could no longer stay quiet. He needed answers. He needed the truth, not hidden behind locked doors but spoken clearly. As the light of morning crept into his room, Kweku went back down to the basement. His steps were steady this time, no longer trembling with fear. The candle was not needed. The sun's brightness filtered through the small basement windows, casting dusty beams across the forgotten room. He stood before the trunk once more, his father's name carved deep into the wood. He touched the name gently as though it were his father's hand. Then, with a deep breath, he lifted the trunk into his arms. It was heavy, but determination carried him. Each step back up the stairs was fueled by a fire in his heart. The mansion's halls seemed longer than ever as he carried the trunk through them. The servants glanced at him curiously, but no one dared to question. Soon he stood before the grand study where Nana Mensa, Abina's father, was reading his morning paper. The old man, dressed in his fine robe, looked up with surprise as Kweku entered. At first, Nana's eyes went wide when he saw what Kweku carried. The color drained from his face and his lips tightened. His hands trembled slightly as he set aside the newspaper. He tried to compose himself, but his voice wavered. "Where did you find that?" he asked. "In the basement," Kweku replied firmly. "Locked away. Hidden." He set the trunk down heavily on the floor. Dust rose in the air, dancing in the morning light. Why was my father's name carved into it? Why are his letters and photographs here? Why is his life locked away in your house? For a moment, silence filled the room. The ticking of the old clock on the wall grew louder, as though time itself demanded the truth. Nana's face, usually strong and proud, seemed to weaken. His eyes, once sharp, now looked clouded with memory. At first he waved a hand dismissively. "It is old history, boy. Things you don't need to trouble yourself with. But Kweku stepped forward, his eyes burning with determination. Do not lie to me. Not today. I deserve to know the truth. I am his son. His voice shook, but it was filled with strength. I will not rest until you tell me. Nana stared at him for a long moment. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then slowly the old man sighed. It was the kind of sigh that carried years of pain, regret, and secrets too heavy to bear. He leaned back in his chair, his shoulders sinking under the invisible weight. You are right, Nana said quietly. You deserve to know. He looked down at the trunk, his eyes lingering on it as though it held the ghosts of his past. His voice grew softer, trembling at times, but his words cut through the silence. Years ago, before all of this wealth, before the world called me a billionaire, I was nothing but a young man with big dreams. Your father, Kwame, was my closest friend. My brother, though not by blood. Together we built everything. The foundation of my empire was also his. He had the ideas, the passion, the fire. I had the connections and the hunger to grow. Side by side, we dreamed of building something that would outlast us. His eyes grew distant, lost in memory. And for a time we did. Those were the best years of my life. Two men chasing the future, two friends who trusted each other with everything. We laughed, we fought, we worked until our hands bled. But then came greed. Nana's voice hardened, carrying the echo of old shame. We grew successful. Too successful. Money poured in. People praised me more than him. Some whispered lies, telling me that Kwame envied me, that he wanted to take it all for himself. Others told him the same about me. Slowly doubt poisoned us. I believed the lies. He did too. The trust we had built cracked. Kweku's fists tightened. His father's letters had spoken of dreams, of unity, not betrayal. I accused him of things he never did, Nana continued, his face pale. I pushed him out of the company we had built together. He begged me to remember our brotherhood, but I was blind. My pride was too strong. I told him he was nothing without me. That he would fail. Nana's hands shook now, his voice breaking. But the truth is, I was the one who failed him. Not long after, tragedy struck. Your father died before he could prove me wrong. And I carried the guilt like a shadow ever since. The old man looked at the trunk, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I locked away his letters, his photographs, everything that reminded me of what I had done. I told no one, not even Abina. I buried it all, hoping to forget. But the past cannot be buried. It waits, silent, until it rises again. Kweku stood frozen, his chest tight with pain. The story cut through him like a blade. To know his father had been betrayed by the very man whose daughter he now loved, it was almost too much to bear. You wronged him, Kweku whispered, his voice shaking with anger. You destroyed his dream. You buried his name. Nana closed his eyes. Yes, I did. And it haunts me every day. When Abina told me she loved you, I did not know you were his son. I never imagined that fate would bring you back into my life this way. Perhaps it is punishment. Perhaps it is mercy. I do not know. The room grew heavy with silence again. The clock ticked on, marking the weight of every heartbeat. Kweku's anger burned, but behind it was sorrow. He thought of his father, of the man who had worked so hard only to be betrayed. He thought of his mother, who had carried the pain of loss quietly for years. And he thought of Abina, innocent in all this, unaware of the war between past and present. What do you want me to do now? Kweku finally asked, his voice low. Nana's eyes met his, filled with regret. That is for you to decide. But know this, though I betrayed your father, I never stopped admiring him. Everything I built carries his spirit. Without him, I would be nothing. Kweku looked at the trunk, the letters spilling out like whispers from the past. His heart was torn between rage and grief. But one thing was clear, the truth could not stay buried anymore. As the morning light filled the room, Kweku knew the next step of his journey was only beginning. The secret his wife's father had hidden would change their family forever. And though the truth was painful, it was now his to carry. The truth spread through the mansion like fire, whispering first in hushed tones between the staff and then echoing in the voices of relatives who had gathered for breakfast. The discovery of the trunk had stirred not only Kweku's heart but the entire household. Some shook their heads, some murmured in disbelief, and others looked at Nana Mensa with a mix of judgment and pity. Yet, in the center of it all stood Kweku, quiet but steady, his wife Abina by his side, her hand locked firmly in his. She had listened to every word of her father's confession the day before. Her face had gone pale, her eyes heavy with grief as she realized the weight of the story hidden beneath her own home. For a while she could not even meet Kweku's eyes, afraid of what he might think of her family. But when she finally did, she saw not anger directed at her but something else, an ache, a storm and a strange kind of calm. She held his hand then, tightly, as though it was the only anchor keeping both of them grounded. That morning the arguments began. Relatives raised their voices, some defending Nana, others condemning him. "He built this empire," one uncle shouted. "Without him, none of us would have the life we live today." Another replied harshly, "But he built it on betrayal. How can we be proud of that?" Kweku stood silent, watching the quarrel unfold. His heart was heavy, but he knew something they did not, that anger would only chain them all to the past. Revenge would only continue the cycle of pain. He turned to Abina, whose eyes were wet with tears, and gently squeezed her hand. Then, with steady steps, he walked to the center of the room. The voices died down as he spoke. His words were not loud, but they carried through the air, each one cutting through the tension like a blade of truth. "The past has already hurt too many people," Kweku said. "It destroyed my father. It has weighed on Nana's soul for years. It has hidden in this house, poisoning the air even in silence. I will not let it take more from us. What matters now is the future." The room fell into a hush. Even the servants stopped moving, their eyes fixed on the young man who stood tall in the grand hall. Abina's heart swelled with pride as she looked at him, the man she had chosen not because of his wealth or his status, but because of the strength she saw in him now. Nana, sitting in his chair with his head lowered, lifted his gaze slowly. His eyes were tired, but in them was something no one had seen in years: softness, humility. He had spent his life surrounded by power, his words feared by many, his wealth making him untouchable. But now, in the presence of the son of the man he had betrayed, he felt small. And for the first time in many years he felt relief. "Kweku," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you are more of a man than I ever was." The staff exchanged looks of surprise. Relatives who had been arguing moments before now sat in silence. The truth had broken something inside the old man, but in its place, something new was rising. Abina stepped forward then, her voice trembling but firm. "Father, you hurt my husband's family and you hurt yourself too. But Kweku is right. We cannot live in the past. We cannot let secrets and shame define us anymore. If this home is to stand, it must stand on honesty." Her words carried the warmth of her heart, and the family could not deny them. One by one, the murmurs softened, the arguments faded, and peace began to return to the room. It was not an easy peace, not one without scars, but it was real. Later that day, the gold trunk was placed in the center of the living room. Not as something hidden in shame, but as a reminder of truth. The letters were read, not only by Kweku but by Abina too, and even Nana listened, his face wet with tears he no longer tried to hide. The words of Kwame, Kweku's father, filled the room like a blessing from the past. Words of dreams, of friendship, of hope for a better tomorrow. They were no longer just letters. They were bridges across time, reaching from a broken friendship to a healing family. For Kweku, the choice to forgive was not easy. His heart still burned with anger when he thought of what his father had lost. But when he looked at Abina, and when he saw the regret carved into Nana's face, he realized that holding on to hate would only destroy him too. Forgiveness was not forgetting. Forgiveness was freedom. In the days that followed, word of the revelation spread quietly among close family and friends. At first, people gossiped, some mocking, others pitying. But soon, something strange happened. Respect grew. People began to admire Kweku, not for marrying into wealth, but for the strength he showed in choosing peace over bitterness. They admired Abina too for standing by her husband through the storm. And even Nana, who once seemed untouchable, found himself humbled in the eyes of others, no longer feared, but seen as a man who carried regrets and was trying at last to make them right. The mansion felt lighter. The locked basement, once a place of secrets, was no longer feared. The trunk remained in the open, its letters and photographs carefully preserved, a reminder that truth, even when painful, was better than silence. At night, when the house was quiet, Kweku and Abina would sit together on the balcony. The city lights stretched out before them, but it was the stars above that caught their eyes. They spoke of the future, not of riches or power, but of a home built on trust, of children who would grow up knowing the full story of their family, and of a love that had carried them through betrayal and storms. For Kweku, the gold in his life was not in money, not in jewels, not even in the empire that his father had once helped to build. The true gold was in truth, in love, in the freedom that came when secrets were finally revealed and forgiveness was chosen over revenge. Abina often whispered as she leaned on his shoulder, We are free now. And each time Kweku would nod, his heart lighter than it had ever been. The past would never change, but the future was theirs to write. And this time it would be written in honesty, not lies. In love, not greed. Together they walked forward, hand in hand, unshaken by the weight of yesterday, ready for the promise of tomorrow. The end.